At just 15, the Prince of Wales collapsed in a sweat-soaked bed, gasping for breath as a strange illness devoured him from within. His name was Arthur Tudor, the boy destined to rule England. But his death rewrote history. The crown passed to his younger brother. The church would fracture. And yet, few remember the boy who died in silence. What really killed him? And what did his absence unleash? He was not yet born when the weight of a fractured kingdom began to press down upon his spine, before his first cry echoed in the stone corridors of Winchester Castle. His name had already been chosen, Arthur, not as a gesture of affection, but as a declaration of destiny, a name heavy with the echoes of Camelot, of round tables and lost golden ages, of kings who healed a land by bleeding for it. But when he emerged, tiny, pale, with limbs like threads of porcelain, there was a silence in the room. Not because he didn't cry, but because some part of the attendants, the midwives, even his own mother, Elizabeth of York, knew instinctively that this child would not grow into the warrior they had summoned from legend. And yet they wrapped him in silk, laid him in a cradle lined with gold embroidery, and whispered that England was whole again. His father, Henry VII, watched from a distance with the eyes of a man who had earned his crown not through inheritance, but through conquest, blood, and gamble. And now, the promise of stability slept beneath lace. But Arthur, even as an infant, did not sleep like other children. Nurses remarked how often his fingers curled as if resisting the air itself. How his eyes, enormous and solemn, lingered too long on shadows cast by the firelight, as if he already sensed that his life would be lived in rooms too grand for comfort and robes too stiff for rest. They said he rarely cried, not from peace, but from something older, quieter, a stillness mistaken for composure, yet born of exhaustion. He grew, but slowly. His tutors recorded his progress in the margins of court reports. Excellent memory, fine diction, exemplary Latin. But never once did they write of joy. His mother tried to hold him, but court rules and dynastic duty peeled him away too soon. They sent him to Ludlow Castle, far from the pulse of courtly life, to be trained as Prince of Wales, as the future of England, as the boy who must not stumble. He was not allowed to run, lest he fall. Not allowed to laugh too loud, lest it seem foolish. Not allowed to cry, for tears are unbecoming of kings. When he walked, his posture was monitored. When he sat, his shoulders were corrected. When he spoke, he had to measure each word as though his very breath carried the weight of treaties, yet unsigned. But inside, beneath velvet collars and handwritten prayers, there beat the heart of a child who yearned for the wind to touch his face without consequence. He once reached out to touch a horse's mane with bare fingers and was scolded, for princes do not touch beasts like stable boys. He once laughed at a jester's joke and was hushed. A prince must not be seen to find delight in nonsense. And so he learned to lower his gaze, to still his hands, to press his longings down into the space between ribs, until even he began to forget what it felt like to desire something simply because it was beautiful. His body betrayed him quietly. It tired easily. His bones ached in the cold. He coughed more in the mornings than a boy should, and no one said it aloud, but everyone adjusted the fire just a little closer when he entered a room. The cradle, once polished and gilded, now sat in storage, no longer needed, but not forgotten. Its image remained in tapestries, in nursery rhymes, in portraits where Arthur sat too still for a child his age, surrounded by books and emblems and the silent, unyielding gaze of ancestry. And though his tutors praised his intellect and the priests admired his piety, it was the silence that grew the fastest within him. The silence of being prepared for a crown he might never wear, of reading aloud to no one, of being seen always but rarely touched. One winter evening, he wrote a letter to his mother, thanking her for her prayers. He signed it in practiced hand, the ink smudged slightly where his fingers had trembled, only for a second, but enough for the page to remember. The page was folded, the seal was pressed, the words were sent away. And yet, he sat there long after the candle had burned low, staring into the flame with a look not of fatigue, but of quiet mourning. Not for someone who had died, but for something inside him that had never been allowed to live. He knew what was expected. He knew the path laid before him. He knew the name he bore, the cradle he had filled, the throne that waited. But deep in the marrow of his being, beneath the layers of education, beneath the weight of royal silk, there was a question that pulsed without cease. Did they give me a crown before they ever let me be a boy? He was not raised in a household. He was constructed in a curriculum. There was no room for scraped knees or sleepless nights beside his mother's bed. Instead, Arthur's life unfolded like a scroll, linear, deliberate, and tightly rolled. Each year designed not to foster discovery, but to manufacture obedience. By the time he was 6, he could recite the genealogies of English kings in order. But he could not describe the sound of laughter when it wasn't practiced for court. When other children asked for toys, he asked once for a dog, and was given a book on falconry instead. And still, he thanked them. The Tudors arrived in waves, Latin before sunrise, history after bread, dance before dusk, theology when the stars returned. Each spoke with the same reverence, the same formality, as though they were not addressing a boy, but a parchment in the shape of a prince. He was taught to hold a quill as though it were a sword, to balance a goblet as though the realm depended on the steadiness of his grip. His handwriting was elegant, his body less so. In long hours seated by cold windows, his spine grew used to stiffness, his hands to ink stains, his eyes to parchment, so much so that when he looked outside, the trees appeared almost imaginary, as if nature belonged to some other version of him that had never been permitted to survive. His letters to the king were praised for their precision. But not once did he write the words, "I am lonely." Not once did he admit that he dreamed of running barefoot through wet grass or hiding behind drapes just to be found. He had long since learned that to speak of longing was to invite rebuke, that to confess discomfort was to show weakness, and weakness was not permitted in the son of a usurper turned king. And so the boy folded inward. He breathed quietly. He nodded when spoken to. He smiled with the kind of courtesy that feels like a page being turned too often, its edges fraying. There were moments, rare, precious, dangerous, when a flicker of something unscripted crossed his face. Like when the choir sang in minor key or when he glimpsed a falcon breaking into sky, its wings slicing the clouds without permission. But such moments passed, and he returned to the rhythm set for him. At Ludlow Castle, they gave him ceremonial duties, presiding over mock councils, receiving messages from Welsh lords, issuing declarations written by others but signed in his hand. His titles, Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester, piled like stones upon his shoulders. He wore them well. But inside, the weight bent him. On paper, he was a sovereign in training. In body, he was a boy with a persistent cough and wrists too thin for the armor they would one day expect him to bear. When the air grew damp, he often felt pain in his chest, not sharp, but creeping, like cold water soaking through wool. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. His silence was a form of discipline. his discipline a kind of performance, and his performance the currency of survival. Everywhere he looked, there were contracts, treaties, alliances, betrothals, each a page longer than his own life, each written in languages he mastered but never chose. Even his future marriage to Catherine of Aragon, arranged before his voice had settled into youth, existed first not in his heart, but in the ink of foreign diplomacy. He was told she was beautiful, that she spoke Spanish and some Latin, that she would be a fitting queen. But what was beauty to a boy who had never been allowed to touch warmth without gloves? What was companionship to someone whose only intimacy came from the daily press of clothing too tight across his chest? What was love to a child whose most frequent gesture was a bowed head? Even his own body, his breath, his aches, his growth, was not considered in his daily schedule unless it interrupted something more important. A lesson, a meeting, a state report. And so he began to understand, in the slow, bitter way only the trained do, that his life was not entirely his. It belonged to England, to the legacy of the Tudors, to the peace bought after bloodshed, to the silent eyes of a father who had killed for the throne and now expected his son to protect it not with violence, but with faultless behavior. Sometimes, at night, Arthur would lie awake and trace invisible lines along the wooden beams above his bed, following the knots in the grain like roads on a map he was not allowed to travel. He would count his breaths, steady, measured, like verses of a psalm. And in those hours, when no voices stirred, when no pages rustled, he allowed himself a single question, one that he never dared to say aloud, for fear it might make itself real. If every part of my life is written by others, when do I begin to exist? They said it was a triumph. The union of England and Spain. 2 crowns sealed with vows, whispered in Latin, and the shimmer of silk rustling beneath vaulted ceilings. An alliance forged not in war, but in adolescence, with 2 children standing at the altar like figures carved from wax, delicate, immobile, and glistening under the eyes of nations. Arthur, 15, with hands still more familiar with parchment than skin, stood beside Catherine of Aragon, just 16, her face a mask of practiced grace, her eyes scanning the assembled clergy, envoys, and nobles with the detached poise of a girl who had been told since infancy that her womb belonged to treaties. They smiled for the court, for the cameras of memory, for the diplomatic scribes who would record the wedding as a historic achievement, a bond between empires. But beneath the layers of velvet, gold, and formality, 2 strangers met in private, alone for the first time, not in a garden or a chapel, but behind the thick wooden door of a marriage chamber. The fire was already lit, the bed already turned down, and the silence impossibly heavy. Catherine curtsied slightly, then rose with a stiffness that had more to do with uncertainty than decorum. And Arthur, despite all the lessons he had memorized, all the speeches prepared for public addresses, all the scripts he had followed since boyhood, suddenly found himself wordless, as if language itself had retreated from this moment, leaving only breath and gaze and the distance between them. He had been told what would happen. He had been told how to undress gently, how to initiate touch, how to preserve dignity while performing duty. But he had not been told how it would feel to tremble beneath sheets that smelled of cedar and anxiety, how difficult it would be to draw breath when his chest already burned with a tightness he could not name, how the very air between them seemed to thicken like steam rising from a fevered body. She sat at the edge of the bed. He coughed once, short, dry. She looked up. He tried to smile. She did not. Outside the door, guards stood. Servants waited in silence. Somewhere in the hall, a dog barked and was immediately hushed. Inside, the bed remained wide, their bodies distant, their hands too shy to reach, their hearts beating rhythms meant for politics, not for one another. When he lay down, he felt the weight of his own limbs, as if they were made of stone. His breath had shortened by then. He had felt it earlier in the evening, a flutter behind his ribs, like a bird trapped beneath the sternum, beating against bone. He thought it nerves. He thought it would pass. But the sweat arrived in the middle of the night, sudden, pooling along his collarbones, soaking the silk like ink, bleeding into cloth. He turned toward her, not to touch, but simply to be seen. She was awake, sitting upright, her hair unpinned and her lips parted, not in speech, but in uncertainty. Neither spoke. There are moments when two souls, no matter how close their bodies, remain continents apart. And so it was. England and Spain, side by side in a marriage bed cold not from rejection, but from distance too wide for ceremony to bridge. When dawn came, the fire had died. The bedclothes were tangled but unmarked. No one would ever agree on what happened that night. Years later, the truth would be demanded by kings, by courts, by clergy, each desperate to know whether flesh had met flesh, whether a crown had been legally shared, whether a lie had been buried beneath brocade. But Arthur would not live to answer, and Catherine would live too long with the weight of that silence. The next day, he rose with difficulty, dressed slowly, fingers stiff as he fastened the buttons of a doublet still damp at the chest. "He looked pale," said one attendant. "His voice was hoarse," said another. But both agreed. He smiled. As he stepped into the corridor, he walked like someone returning from a ceremony, not an embrace. Later that week, he coughed again, and this time blood kissed the edge of his handkerchief. A thin line, barely visible, but unmistakable in its accusation. The physicians were summoned. They whispered possibilities, excuses, Latin terms too long to frighten the court. No one dared call it a curse. No one dared call it fate. No one dared suggest that the bed they had made, the vows they had sworn, might now lie at the center of a storm no alliance could contain. And still the servants lit the fire each night. Still they turned the sheets. Still they laid down a robe no longer worn. And still the boy, barely 15, returned to the bed not with anticipation, but with a weariness that clung to his skin like damp wool. He would lie beside his bride, say little, sleep little, breathe with difficulty, and dream not of love, but of open air, of green fields, of childhood, of a time before his body had become a vessel for kingdoms. The marriage, like the boy, was frail, beautiful on the outside, hollow underneath, held together by the force of expectation and the fear of collapse. No witnesses could testify to joy. No documents could confirm connection. And even now, centuries later, historians still debate. Was the union consummated? But perhaps the more haunting question is not what they did in that bed, but what they felt when the door closed and silence fell. What happens to a kingdom when its future lies awake beside a stranger, sweating through a night meant for unity, and finds only distance in return? It did not begin with a scream or a sudden fall. There was no lightning crack across the castle walls, no thunderous sign that history had begun to tilt, just a lingering tightness in his chest, a discomfort so familiar it might have been ignored. Were it not for the way his fingers twitched when he tried to lift the goblet, the way the warmth in his throat refused to fade. and the way the sunlight that morning seemed too bright for his eyes to bear. Arthur said nothing at first, because princes do not complain of aches unless they interrupt diplomacy. And pain, after all, was just another weight he had long ago learned to carry with the straight spine of royal discipline. But by evening, his shirt clung to his back like wet paper, and his breath came in measured gasps that never seemed to fill his lungs completely, as if the very air of Ludlow had turned thin, cruel, and unwilling to share itself with a boy whose body had never been truly his to begin with. The physicians were summoned discreetly. They arrived not with panic, but with practiced urgency, carrying satchels of dried herbs and scrolls of treatments that had not changed in 50 years. They felt his pulse, racing. They lifted his eyelids, glassy. They touched his chest and found heat radiating not from the firelight, but from within. A fever that did not rise like a wave, but surged like a flood with no end in sight. The servants whispered the words no one dared say aloud. The sweat is back. The sweating sickness, that strange and brutal illness that had crept through England in waves like a silent predator, had returned, not as a plague of thousands, but as a thief of one, come not for the peasants this time, but for the heir to the crown. There was no rash, no swelling, no time, only this: an overwhelming heat that soaked the bed before dawn, drenching the sheets, pooling in the hollows of his collarbone, running down his back in cold, nervous lines. They changed his clothes again and again, drying his chest with linen so often it became transparent, until one physician, trembling slightly, whispered that it was as if the boy's body were trying to rid itself of blood without bleeding. His skin grew pale, then gray. His eyes, those wide, somber eyes that had once stared too long at candlelight, now struggled to stay open, not from drowsiness, but from sheer exhaustion, like shutters in a windstorm trying to hold against something far more powerful than weather. The sweat would not stop, not after herbs, not after prayers, not after water poured over his body or leeches drawn to his skin like ink to parchment. And still, Arthur said little. He lay there, chest rising and falling like waves trapped in a dying tide, his hands resting upon his stomach, fingers curled as if still clutching the edge of dignity. Catherine was moved from the room. She had fallen ill as well, though more mildly, but it was not the illness that took her away. It was the ritual of protection, the belief that isolation could halt death, that doors could shield one soul from another's unraveling. And so, he was left alone with the priests, the physicians, the scent of vinegar boiling in basins by the door, and the slow, dreadful awareness that this was not a fever he would rise from like before. He asked for wine. It spilled before it reached his mouth. He tried to sit. His body refused to obey. He tried to pray. The words collapsed before they reached his lips. The cradle that had once held him, the golden, over-ornamented thing that had symbolized hope, returned now as a silhouette in the minds of the court, slowly transforming into the outline of a coffin. And still, no one said the word death. They said fever. They said rest. They said recovery. But their voices broke on the edges. No one told him what was happening. But Arthur had always known things before he was told. Even now he understood. Not with fear, but with a sorrow so deep it no longer needed expression. The kind of sorrow that exists in the marrow, in the silence between heartbeats, in the chill of a breeze through a room that should have remained warm. He looked toward the window. It was too far to reach. Even if it had been open, even if he had found the strength to stand, there was no air left in the world that could cool the burning of his skin from inside. The room, though full of people, began to feel unoccupied. The priest recited a litany. The physicians repeated the same instructions. The servants moved quietly, as though sound itself might offend the fever. And still, Arthur remained at the center. Not the source of attention, but the eye of a storm collapsing inward. Quietly, steadily, completely. By the third night, he stopped speaking altogether. Not because he had lost the will, but because there was no longer space between breaths for words to fit. The sweat continued. It soaked the mattress, dripped from his temples, matted his hair. The sheets were changed and changed again, until no one could remember what dry cloth felt like. And then, his hand slipped from the edge of the bed, limp, cold, trailing toward the floor like a branch bent under rain. A gasp escaped one attendant. Someone crossed themselves. No one knew if this was the end, because with the sweating sickness, there was no rhythm, no pattern, only a fever that devoured and vanished as it pleased, leaving survivors or silence in its wake. But Arthur no longer moved. And in that moment, in the dim candlelight flickering against walls that had heard too many secrets, the prince who had been named after legend, trained for monarchy and married for empire, lay there with his eyes closed and his mouth slightly parted, as if trying to taste one final breath. Could the future of a kingdom truly melt away in nothing more than 3 nights of sweat? They sealed the castle not with proclamations, but with silence. No trumpets were blown, no banners lowered, no panic declared. Only orders whispered between guards, passed from corridor to corridor like a dying echo. No one enters. No one leaves. The gates of Ludlow Castle closed with the soft finality of a sentence already written, and the world outside, the world of court, of procession, of kings and dowries and papal correspondence, held its breath, as if unsure whether to weep or wait. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of damp stone, burning herbs, and something less nameable, a kind of spiritual weight, the heaviness that gathers when life begins to slip from a place, but is not yet left completely. Arthur lay still, not out of peace, but because his body no longer offered him motion. The sweat that had soaked his bed for days now came in bursts, his body oscillating between fevers and chills, as though undecided whether to burn or freeze. And his skin, gray at the temples, flushed at the chest, seemed to bear the confusion and blotches of color that no ointment could soothe. Outside his chamber, Catherine knelt by the door, her head bowed, hands folded, lips murmuring prayers in Spanish, in Latin, in whatever language she believed might reach a God that now felt terribly far. She had not seen him in 2 days. The physicians had forbidden it, not from cruelty, but from the same ritual logic that governed plague and sacrament. Protect the living, preserve the symbol, and accept that grief must sometimes take place at a distance. She asked for a message. None came. She asked to bring him water. They refused. She asked, finally, to simply hear his voice through the door, and was met with a pause so long that silence itself seemed to grow teeth. And still, inside, Arthur breathed. Not rhythmically, not peacefully, but with a struggle so pronounced it became a sound of its own, a rough, hollow rasp that filled the chamber like the ticking of a clock. No one dared look at directly. He asked once for his mother, not with panic, not with desperation, but with a quiet, exhausted longing, the kind that belongs only to children who know they will not be held again. Elizabeth of York was days away. No messenger could reach her in time. He asked later for his father, but kings are not summoned to deathbeds unless there is something left to fix. And Henry VIII, ruler of a newly stabilized realm, architect of peace, guardian of the fragile Tudor claim, did not come. Whether it was strategy or fear, none could say. But the boy remained alone. The prayers began in shifts. Monks rotated in and out of the antechamber, chanting beneath their breath, voices weaving like smoke, rising and falling with the candlelight. The same words repeated again and again. Not because they still believed they might change something, but because without them, the silence might become unbearable. Physicians stood nearby, their faces pale, their hands never still. They measured his pulse, now thin as thread. They listened to his chest, where breath caught like wind in a broken flute. They adjusted his sheets, changed his gown, burned orange peel and mint to cleanse the air. But they no longer gave orders. They observed. They waited. And in their waiting, something inside them began to grieve. Once, in the early hours of the fifth night, Arthur stirred. Not fully, not with speech, but with a trembling of the fingers, a slight turn of the head, as though responding to a voice that was not present. A single ring slipped from his hand, a small band, simple, given by Catherine the day after their wedding, when shyness had given way to shared hope. The ring hit the stone floor with a sound too soft to be noticed by most, but loud enough for one nurse to look up sharply, startled by the intimacy of metal meeting stone. The sudden reminder that even royalty loses its grip in the end. The ring rolled once, twice, and disappeared into shadow. No one retrieved it. They did not want to look under the bed. That space had become sacred, terrifying, a threshold. By now, Arthur's eyes had grown cloudy, not from tears but from fever so prolonged it no longer spiked, simply simmered beneath the surface, a fire without flame. His lips cracked at the corners. His voice, when it did emerge, was no longer English. It was breath in search of words. One monk leaned in, thinking he heard confession. But there was no guilt, no sin to purge. Only the fragments of things left unsaid, half-formed prayers, echoes of names, perhaps memories. And as dawn broke again, sluggish and gray, a kind of stillness fell across the room that was not peace, but a quiet recognition that the battle was nearly over. Not the kind of battle sung in ballads, but the slow, brutal resistance of a child's lungs against forces older than any kingdom. In the hallway, Catherine sat back on her heels. She had not slept. She held her rosary tight enough to bruise. She whispered the same words again and again, not because she expected them to work, but because without them, there would be only the sound of nothing. And perhaps that was the worst sound of all. No horses stirred in the courtyard. No servants laughed in the kitchen. No bells rang from the chapel. Only the rhythm of his breathing, rougher now, heavier, like something being dragged across stone, and the flickering of a candle that refused to stay lit, no matter how often it was replaced. Outside the castle, England remained unaware. The court was too distant, the messengers too slow. No herald had announced the crisis. No nation had yet begun to mourn. But inside these walls, the future was unraveling. Quietly, softly, invisibly. And no one, not the priests, not the physicians, not the girl behind the door, could hold it in place. Can a prince die without his kingdom even noticing the moment he disappears? It was not a loud death. There was no final scream, no convulsion that bent his frame like a struck tree, no dramatic gesture that history could immortalize in paintings or song. Arthur simply stopped moving, One moment, his chest rose in a shallow, uneven lift, as if inhaling were an act borrowed from the living, something he no longer fully owned. And in the next, that breath did not return, and the room held the silence as though it were a holy object, fragile and absolute. No one spoke. Not the monk who had been reading aloud from the Psalms, not the physician whose hand still rested over the prince's wrist, waiting for a pulse he would never feel again. Not the servant who dropped the cloth mid-fold, its corner brushing the floor like a lowered flag. And so, the future died without announcement, in a bed soaked through with sweat, beneath a ceiling that had seen too much and understood nothing. The ring Catherine had given him still lay beneath the bed, its presence both forgotten and unbearable. There was no explosion of grief, only a slow recoil, the way the world seems to lean away when it realizes that something once sacred has ceased to be. The candle at the foot of the bed flickered once, twice, then died. Outside, it began to rain. Not a storm, just a steady, colorless drizzle, the kind that seems to blur outlines, soften edges, turn people into silhouettes, and stone into wet memory. The announcement of his death traveled slowly. It did not ride on a trumpet or rush upon royal parchment. It moved instead from mouth to mouth, from gasps behind curtains to footsteps down narrow corridors, until someone finally had the courage to wake Catherine and tell her that the boy she had been promised, the boy who had never fully become hers, was gone. She did not cry immediately. She simply sat in the silence that followed the news, her hands still clasped as if in prayer, her eyes unfocused, her lips slightly parted, like someone listening for a voice that would not speak again. She asked to see him. They refused. She insisted. They yielded. And so, Catherine, barefoot, draped in a shawl too thin for the spring chill, entered the room that still smelled of sweat and bitter herbs and dying wax, and stood beside the boy who had once been her husband, though never quite her companion. She said nothing. She touched nothing. She only looked. At the face now sunken, the eyes closed not in peace but in exhaustion, the mouth slightly parted as if caught between sigh and prayer. Some say she whispered to him. Others say she merely watched. No one wrote it down. And so, even in death, their intimacy remained a question, a space history could never quite illuminate. Preparations began before the body had fully cooled. They brought the lead-lined coffin from Worcester, heavy, unyielding, designed to preserve dignity and contain decay. The room was scrubbed, the linens burned, the windows opened to release the sickness. No portraits were draped in black, no cathedral bells were tolled. For while Arthur was heir, he was not yet king, and in courts that worship continuity, grief is often considered an indulgence reserved for those who ruled. The funeral procession moved days later through mud-drenched roads, horses waited with silence, banners damp and limp in the wet breeze. They did not carry him in triumph. There was no music, no crowds pressing close to glimpse the casket, only a few nobles, a handful of clergy. The distant thunder of hooves softened by spring rain. Catherine was not permitted to follow. It was decided, by protocol, by physicians, by people who feared both scandal and sorrow, that she should remain at Ludlow, recovering from her own illness. Though some whispered that she had already begun mourning in ways too quiet for courtiers to understand. She stood at a high window as the procession passed beyond the outer gates. Her breath fogged the glass. She raised no hand. She made no sound. The coffin was placed in Worcester Cathedral, Beneath the stone arches that rose like frozen waves above the altar, there was a Latin prayer, a reading, a final sprinkling of water across the casket's lid, which hissed slightly as the droplets touched its cold surface. Then silence again, deep, uninterrupted, eternal. And in that silence, a shift occurred, not just in the line of succession, but in the center of gravity of a kingdom that did not yet understand what it had lost. For in the burial of Arthur, England laid to rest not only a boy, but a version of its future, one that had promised unity without rupture, faith without reformation, continuity without catastrophe. The cradle that had once held him, displayed like a relic in the royal nursery, was quietly removed days later. Some say it was dismantled for parts. Others say it remained in a storeroom, covered in velvet, its gold inlay tarnishing slowly in the dark. No one recorded where it went. It vanished, like him. At court, the news arrived with ceremony, but not sorrow. Henry VII received it with a face carved in stone. He retreated for days. When he emerged, it was to renegotiate the Spanish alliance, not to grieve. Elizabeth of York, upon hearing of her son's death, collapsed, according to one account, and never fully recovered. She would die less than a year later. Some said of infection, others whispered it was grief. But by then, the court had already begun preparing the younger son. Henry, loud where Arthur had been soft, vibrant where Arthur had been careful, hungry where Arthur had been quiet. The throne would not remain empty. The bride would be reassigned. The prayers would continue, but under different names. The portrait of Arthur, once displayed in anticipation, was moved to a smaller hall. The ink on his treatise faded. The lessons he learned were transferred to another child. The world kept spinning. But the bed remained empty, and in the quiet halls of Ludlow, beneath ceilings that had once echoed with the whispered promises of a future England, there lingered only one question, suspended like dust in the light. What happens to a crown when the head it waited for is buried in cold stone before it ever touched his brow? She was 15 and already a widow. Not in the way that songs or scriptures describe, with weeping veils and open coffins, with black-draped halls echoing elegies, but in the quiet, suspended way of those left behind, not just by death, but by the uncertain machinery of court, alliance, and royal expectation. Catherine of Aragon, once hailed as the Infanta of Spain, daughter of two Catholic monarchs who had stitched together an empire with their crowns and their crusades, now stood in a foreign land, wrapped in silence far heavier than any mourning cloth. They told her to rest. They told her to pray. They told her not to speak too openly about her loss, lest sorrow be mistaken for instability and questions arise that no one was yet prepared to answer. She had no husband. She had no child. She had no nation, really, not yet. Only rooms in a castle too large for one girl, hallways too quiet, and the persistent pressure of eyes watching to see whether her grief would be too much or too little. She wore black. She wrote to Spain. The letter survives, written in a delicate, slanted hand that betrays no tremor. My husband is gone. I know not what God wishes for me now. A single sentence. No mention of fever, no mention of sweat, no mention of the hours she had spent at his door, waiting to be let in. Only loss, only faith. Only the wide, open silence of a girl who had been taught that sorrow must always be shaped into scripture. But what prayer was left to her now? She had fulfilled the alliance. She had said her vows. She had endured the distance, the training, the strangeness of a new land, a new language. A boy husband who spoke softly and smiled politely and then vanished into death before their bodies had even found a rhythm. And now she was told that the alliance might not be over, only paused. Because the dowry had not been fully paid, because the marriage may or may not have been consummated, because England still needed Spain, and treaties, like ghosts, do not always rest when the bodies do. So they kept her, not with violence, not with chains, but with protocol, diplomacy, and the slow, crushing ambiguity of being necessary but not wanted, noble but not yet royal. A bride who had fulfilled her role only to find herself waiting again, without title, without clarity, without touch. The bed where she had once lain beside Arthur remained unchanged for weeks. The sheets were washed, the room aired, but no one else was placed inside it. Not yet. She walked past that door daily. Sometimes she paused, not to remember. She had never been allowed to make enough memories for nostalgia, but to confirm that it was still there, that she had not imagined it, that the silence inside was real, that she had once belonged to something, however briefly. The court treated her kindly, but distantly. Some women offered condolences, others avoided her gaze. Young men, newly aware of her widowhood, approached her with exaggerated courtesy, not out of affection, but calculation. She had become an equation in a foreign crown's ledger, her name not spoken with warmth, but measured against future marriage prospects, possible heirs, renewed treaties. And Catherine, who had grown up at the center of Spanish piety, surrounded by power and pageantry, began to understand something far colder than death. What it meant to become a living question, suspended between roles, between dynasties, between chapters of history that others would write around her. She clutched her rosary until her fingers ached. She fasted longer than was required. She whispered her confessions not for absolution, but for the comfort of hearing her own voice say that she still existed. The ring she had once slipped onto Arthur's finger, simple, unadorned, chosen by her with the hope that it might be his to keep, was never returned. She did not ask for it. She preferred to believe that it had remained with him, even if no one had buried it with the body, even if it lay still, forgotten, beneath a bed that no longer belonged to either of them. Her sisters wrote to her from Spain. Her mother, Queen Isabella, sent envoys with advice, reassurances, veiled warnings. But distance stretches even between queens and daughters, especially when oceans and thrones lie between them. Catherine was no longer a girl of Spain, but neither had she yet become a woman of England. She was a pause in the line of succession, a breath held between two kings. And though Henry, the younger brother, was already being whispered about in chambers and courtyards, as taller, louder, stronger, more promising, he did not visit her. Not yet. Not while the mourning veil still hung. Not while Arthur's name was still spoken, however briefly, however reluctantly. But Catherine watched, and listened, and waited. Not for love, not even for purpose, but for clarity. Because in every hour she spent in that in-between, neither wife nor widow, neither cast aside nor fully embraced, a part of her learned how kingdoms bend women without breaking them, how grief is politicized, how silence can be worn like armor. She prayed for Arthur, not for his soul. She was certain it had gone where saints go, but for his memory, that it would not vanish, that his name would not fade, that she would not be the only one to carry his ghost. And still, no bells rang for him, no court in Spain held vigil, no masses were commissioned. Only a girl in mourning robes walking the halls of a foreign castle, remembering the shape of a boy's breath as it faltered beside her, the color of his skin in candlelight. the softness of a smile that had come too late. When a future is erased before it begins, what is left of the name once whispered beside yours? He did not inherit it in a blaze of ceremony, nor reach for it with trembling hands. It simply landed in his path, silent and heavy, like a garment he had not asked for, but quickly discovered fit better than expected. Henry, the second son, had always lived in Arthur's shadow, not resentfully, not with rebellion, but with the quiet understanding that his was a supporting role, a place in the chorus behind the carefully tuned voice of the future king. A boy born not to rule, but to reinforce the lineage should misfortune ever breach the palace gates. And now misfortune had arrived, not with swords or fire, but with a sickness that soaked a bed and silenced a prince. And in its wake the shadow was gone. And Henry stood blinking in the light. He was just 10 years old when Arthur died. Too young to grasp the enormity, too old to escape its consequences. His tutors changed overnight. The expectations that had once bent Arthur's spine were now laid across Henry's shoulders. And where Arthur had grown careful, reserved, methodical, Henry moved with the restless energy of someone both aware of his luck and intoxicated by it. He had always been stronger, taller, louder. Arthur had been delicate, precise, a candle protected from wind. Henry was flame itself, bright and unpredictable, and the court, still reeling from loss, found comfort in the idea that perhaps this second son was, in fact, the better mold all along. He learned quickly. He smiled often. He held a sword with ease and danced with a charm that made dignitaries from Spain and France forget, for a moment, the weight of treaties and the shadow of death that still lingered in Ludlow. And yet, no matter how brightly he shone, Arthur remained in the corners of the palace, not in presence, but in absence. His name etched into ledgers, his handwriting on old letters, his promises folded into parchment that no longer held power. The cradle that had once been gilded for him was repainted. The ring that had vanished was never replaced. The Latin tutors who had praised Arthur's piety now tutored Henry in the language of diplomacy and power. And though they rarely spoke of the boy who came before, the silence was dense with memory. Catherine still lived at court, still wore black in the early months, still spoke of Arthur occasionally, though only in the ways that made others uncomfortable. Too warm, too real, too close to pain that had not yet been filed away by time. And Henry, who had once passed her in corridors with the wide-eyed reverence of a child, now began to see her not only as a remnant of a brother lost, but as a thread that could still tie England to Spain. The question arose, carefully at first, then more urgently, whether Catherine might marry again, whether the widow of the Prince of Wales could become queen still, and more quietly, whether she and Arthur had ever truly shared the bed, whether the union had been fulfilled, whether a second marriage to a brother could be justified before God and Pope. Henry said little, but he listened. He watched. And as years passed and his body grew into that of a man kings feared and women admired, he began to imagine the crown not as something passed down, but as something that had always waited for him, simply biding time beneath his brother's brief and broken reign. No coronation was spoken of yet, but the air around him began to change. People bowed longer. Ambassadors addressed him more formally. Catherine, now out of mourning, began to receive gifts again. The ghost of Arthur was not yet gone, but his footsteps no longer echoed in the corridors. They were muffled by the boots of a younger prince whose stride lengthened with each passing month. There was no ceremony to mark the shift, no public moment where one name was carved out and another written in its place. But quietly, behind doors and within ledgers. The transformation was sealed. Arthur, once the vessel of hope, had become the threshold, and Henry, the second son, stepped through him. He would one day marry Catherine. He would one day take the crown. He would one day split the Church of England from Rome, ignite a Reformation, father queens and dead sons, and remake history with every wife, every law, every signature. But none of that had happened yet. He was still a boy, still half-formed, still bearing the weight of a brother's unfinished story. He rarely spoke Arthur's name, perhaps out of reverence, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps because he knew, on some wordless level, that he was walking atop a foundation built from another boy's silence. The same bed, the same throne, the same bride, and yet nothing truly the same. Because what Arthur carried in quiet obedience, Henry would wield with thunder. What Arthur whispered, Henry would declare. What Arthur lost in sweat and solitude, Henry would take in fire and crown. They were not enemies. They were not rivals. They were not friends. They were two halves of a dynasty. One consumed early, the other burning long, one a breath that faltered, the other a voice that reshaped nations. But no monument stood between them. No bridge. No words passed. Just a shift. And in that shift, Arthur dissolved. In the portraits that followed, Henry stood alone. In the hymns, Arthur's name was not sung. In the prayers, he became a line edited out for brevity. Even in Catherine's gaze, something turned, not out of betrayal, but necessity. The human instinct to live, to adapt, to not wither beside a tomb sealed too soon. And so, Henry rose, and Arthur sank. And England, unknowingly, began its next chapter on pages soaked through with a silence it never paused to read. Can one brother's breath truly replace another's absence? Or does history remember the echo more than the voice that follows it? Time, when it forgets, does not do so all at once. It begins slowly, delicately, almost gently. First with the silencing of a name in conversation, then with the shifting of a portrait from the main hall to a quieter chamber, then with the repurposing of books that once bore inscriptions no longer read, and eventually with the absence of candles lit on anniversaries that only a few still remember to count. Arthur's name was not erased. It was simply displaced, moved to the margins, to the footnotes of succession charts and the side panels of tapestries now fraying in silence. The Tudors who once praised his Latin began using his old lessons for Henry. The courtiers who once bowed to him now corrected themselves when speaking to the new heir. And the spaces he had touched, the cradle repainted, the writing desk reassigned, the walking path he once favored during morning studies, became common ground, walked on without pause, without reverence, without realization that a boy had once dreamed there, ached there, breathed there until he could not. Worcester Cathedral still held his bones, but the prayers offered there grew fainter, more formal, until they were said more for tradition than love. Even the stone slab that marked his grave, once a place of whispered tears from the mother who followed him too soon, became a station of passing glances, its inscription in Latin read only by scholars, not mourners. Here lies Arthur, Prince of Wales, the hope that was. A sentence both full and hollow, a benediction, a resignation, a memory distilled into grammar. And still, no bells rang on his birthday. No holiday bore his name. No kings invoked his wisdom. Even his ring, the one Catherine had slipped onto his finger that first night, was never found, perhaps still beneath the bed in Ludlow. perhaps swept into darkness, perhaps buried in linen no longer remembered, perhaps carried off by hands too practical to believe in relics. The few letters he had written to his mother, delicate notes filled with careful penmanship and restrained affection, were kept in a drawer for a time until her death, after which they disappeared. No one recorded what became of them. No one asked. The court did not erase him with malice. They simply rearranged themselves around the living. And the living were loud. Henry, now growing into his voice, his muscle, his taste for ceremony and conquest, filled every room with a presence so commanding that the absence of his brother began to feel like a myth. Something too faint, too distant, too still to reconcile with the thunder of what came after. Catherine, though she had loved quietly, mourned discreetly, and remembered sharply, began to shape her words to fit the narrative being written without her, until even her recollections of Arthur were compressed into the language of diplomacy, not longing. She rarely spoke of the bed, of the sickness, of the final prayer through the door. Instead, she learned to speak of future alliances, of English customs, of Henry's courtship, and of a kingdom that needed heirs, not ghosts. And though she never forgot Arthur's voice, soft, precise, occasionally uncertain, she knew that speaking it aloud would invite questions, doubts, and a scrutiny that might burn the very memory she wanted to protect. So she buried it, deep beneath layers of royal robes, diplomatic silences, and the practical weight of survival. Even Elizabeth of York, who had once lit candles for her firstborn with fingers that trembled despite royal grace, died before she could demand that his legacy be preserved with the reverence due to those who die too soon. And with her gone, Arthur lost his last advocate in the realm of private memory. Only the walls remembered him now. Ludlow's corridors still echoed faintly with the sound of his steps, barefoot on winter mornings when the floor was too cold and he was too proud to call for slippers. The chapel still held the soft indentation in the kneeling pillow where he once prayed for strength he suspected would never arrive. The window he had once leaned against, fogging the glass with breath he didn't know was numbered, still opened onto a field he never walked again. But walls do not speak. They hold, they absorb, and eventually, they forget too. England had no use for boys who died before they ruled. The crown, like a river, flows forward. It does not pause to mourn those who never wore it. It folds their names into scrolls unread, their faces into coins unminted, their voices into wind that passes through stone cathedrals but leaves no echo behind. Arthur became that kind of wind. Present, but unheard. Essential, but invisible. His life, once described as the embodiment of dynastic hope, was now reduced to a prelude, a prologue, a what-if, attached to the reign of a brother who would become both legend and warning. There were those who remembered, quietly, stubbornly. A servant who kept the feather quill Arthur favored, even after ink no longer flowed. A monk who spoke his name at night, prayers even when the abbey no longer required it. A child in Worcester who once asked who lay beneath the stone and was told, a boy who never became king. But memory, without repetition, becomes dust. And Arthur, without a throne, without a child, without even a voice left to quote, became a space between stories, a shadow that time stepped over without apology. What does it mean to be the prince who only prepared and never ruled? He died without ever commanding an army, without holding court, without issuing a single law or wearing the crown that had waited for him since his cradle was polished and gilded with the expectation of legacy. He died not in battle, not in betrayal, not in glory, but in the soft decay of a bedroom soaked in sweat, wrapped in damp sheets, beneath ceilings too high and candles too dim, a boy shivering in the center of England's fate while the kingdom turned its eyes elsewhere. He died before he was ever tested, before his heart could harden with power, before his ambition could be measured, before his shadow could stretch across a continent. And yet, Arthur changed everything. His death, more than any decision he might have made in life, redirected the river of English history, forged in a fever, sharpened in silence, and signed not with ink, but absence. Because Arthur died, Henry ruled. Because Arthur died, Catherine of Aragon became a queen not through love, but through contingency. Because Arthur died, a marriage once questioned became the spark that fractured the church, sent England into schism, burned martyrs, crowned new queens, beheaded others, and birthed an empire that rose not from peace, but from the aftermath of a boy's last breath. He left no heir, but many consequences. He spoke no famous lines, but generations quoted the laws born from the gap he left behind. He fought no wars, but history trembled in his wake, reshaped by the very fact of his vanishing. He is not remembered in triumph, but in the quiet tremble of what could have been, in the almosts, in the unopened doors, in the sealed letters that bear his signature, but not his reign. His life was not a reign. It was a rehearsal that ended before the curtain rose. And the tragedy was not that he failed. The tragedy was that he was never allowed to try. Not strong enough to lead, yet too precious to ignore. Not long enough to rule, yet too important to forget. He was a bridge, never stepped on, but still necessary for what crossed after. He was the breath before a sentence, the silence before the bell, the boy who bore a name too heavy for his lungs. And in the end, what is left? A ring that vanished, a bed that grew cold, a tomb that bears a name, but not a memory. And yet, without him, none of it unfolds. Without his death, there is no Henry VIII, no break from Rome, no Anne Boleyn, no Elizabeth, no empire, no rupture. Just another quiet England that might have followed Rome, walked the path of obedience, lived and died beneath popes and foreign alliances. But Arthur died, and history, greedy, merciless, impatient, devoured the silence he left behind and used it as kindling. And yet, no bells toll for him. No anthem bears his name. No holiday marks his departure. He is the prince who died in spring, and all England bloomed without him. I think about Arthur more often than the world ever intended. Not because he ruled. He didn't. Not because he triumphed. He couldn't. But because his life reminds me that history is not only made by those who act, but also by those who are removed before the page even turns. His tragedy is quiet, but echoing. It teaches us that even the most carefully prepared, the most sculpted, the most destined, can vanish before they are ever allowed to be seen whole. And when I look at his story, I wonder how many others have been lost that way. How many futures ended in fever before the world ever had the chance to love them, hate them, or remember them. Arthur's crown was never placed, but its shape lingered on every brow that came after him. And perhaps that is the cruelest, most enduring kind of legacy. What do we owe to the princes who never became kings, but still broke history open by dying too soon?